A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The kitchen floor was freezing against Lyra's knees as she scrubbed at the stone tiles in the pre-dawn darkness, her hands raw and red from the icy water that sloshed in the wooden bucket beside her. The same bucket she'd been using for the past 3 hours as she worked her way across the massive packhouse kitchen, while everyone else in the Shadow Moon pack slept warm and comfortable in their beds. The silence of the early morning should have been peaceful, should have been a gift to someone like her, who lived in a world without her own voice. But instead, it felt oppressive and heavy, pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight that reminded her with every passing moment that she was alone, that she had always been alone, and that she would die alone just as she had lived. Her silver hair, long and flowing like molten moonlight, hung in a thick braid down her back, and she could feel the dampness of it from where she'd accidentally dunked the end in the wash water, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of her worn dress and making her shiver in the darkness that was broken only by the dying embers in the massive hearth that dominated one wall of the kitchen. She paused in her scrubbing for just a moment, sitting back on her heels and pressing one wet hand against the small of her back, where a persistent ache had been building for hours, the result of bending over the floor for so long without rest. And she closed her violet-gray eyes against the tears that threatened to spill over because she was so tired, so bone-deep exhausted from a life that consisted of nothing but work and rejection, and the constant, gnawing awareness that she was different in a way that made people uncomfortable, in a way that made them look at her and see something wrong, something broken, something that needed to be cast out before it contaminated the rest of the pack with whatever curse the moon goddess had seen fit to mark her with. 24 years of life, and not a single one of those years had been easy. Not a single day had passed without her being reminded that her silver hair was unnatural, that her inability to speak was a sign of divine displeasure, that her very existence was an inconvenience to everyone around her, who had to deal with the reality of an Omega who couldn't fulfill even the most basic functions of her designation. Because how could you soothe pack tensions when you couldn't speak? How could you bear pups and raise them when you couldn't call out to them, or sing them lullabies, or tell them you loved them with actual words that came from your throat instead of desperate gestures and hastily scribbled notes that most wolves couldn't be bothered to read? The sound of footsteps on the stairs that led down from the upper floors made Lyra's entire body tense with anticipation and dread, because she knew what was coming, knew it with the kind of certainty that came from living through the same nightmare over and over again until the pattern was burned into your very soul. She kept her head down and continued scrubbing, her movements becoming more frantic as she tried to finish the section she was working on before the other Omegas arrived, because if she wasn't done with her assigned area by the time they came down to start preparing breakfast, they would make her pay for it in 100 small and cruel ways that added up to a misery that sometimes felt worse than outright violence, because at least violence was quick and clean and over with, while their casual cruelty lingered and festered and reminded her constantly that she was less than them, that she was other, that she was unwanted. Clara was the first to appear, her blonde hair perfectly styled even at this ungodly hour, her pretty face twisted into an expression of disgust as she took in the sight of Lyra on her knees scrubbing the floor. And Lyra didn't need to hear the words to know what was coming, because she'd heard them all before in 1,000 different variations, each one designed to cut a little deeper, to hurt a little more, to remind her that she had no voice to defend herself with, and therefore no defense at all. "Well, well, well, look who's still scrubbing away like the pathetic little ghost girl she is," Clara said, her voice carrying across the kitchen with a cheerfulness that was somehow more cutting than outright anger would have been. And the three other Omegas who had followed her down the stairs laughed in that particular way that women laugh when they're part of a group that's found a target to torment. A sound that was high and bright and completely devoid of any real humor or warmth. Tell me, freak, did you manage to say good morning to the floor? Or is your silence so complete that even inanimate objects don't deserve the courtesy of a greeting from you? The other Omegas laughed harder at this, as if Clara had said something genuinely witty instead of just cruel. And Lyra kept her eyes fixed on the floor, kept scrubbing, kept her face carefully blank, even as something hot and angry twisted in her chest. Something that wanted to scream and rage and fight back, but couldn't, could never, because her voice was locked away behind a curse that had been placed on her bloodline 3 generations ago by a corrupted alpha who had wanted to punish her great-grandmother for having the audacity to speak truth to power. Clara walked closer, her expensive leather boots clicking against the stones that Lyra had just finished cleaning. And then, with a deliberate, casual cruelty that took Lyra's breath away, she tipped over the bucket of dirty wash water, sending it cascading across the floor in a spreading puddle that covered everything Lyra had spent the last 3 hours cleaning. The dark, grimy water soaking into the hem of Lyra's dress and splashing up onto her face and hair. "Oops," Clara said with mock concern, her hand flying to her mouth in an exaggerated gesture of surprise. "How clumsy of me! I seem to have undone all your hard work, which means you'll have to start over, won't you? And isn't that just terrible timing, considering breakfast needs to be started in less than an hour, and the alpha will be furious if his morning meal is delayed because the mute freak was too busy scrubbing floors to do her actual job." The injustice of it hit Lyra like a physical blow, because scrubbing the floors had been the job they'd assigned her, had been the task she'd been given by the head Omega yesterday evening, with explicit instructions to have it done before dawn. And now Clara was acting as if Lyra had chosen to spend her night on her hands and knees instead of doing something more important, as if this was somehow Lyra's fault, instead of another in a long line of impossible situations designed to make her fail no matter what she did. Lyra's hands trembled as she reached for her leather journal. The one item she owned that meant anything to her. The one thing she could use to communicate with the wolves who bothered to read what she wrote. But before her fingers could close around it, Clara's boot came down hard on the journal, pinning it to the floor with enough force that Lyra heard something crack inside the binding. "Oh no," Clara said with exaggerated sympathy that dripped with sarcasm and malice. "Did something happen to your precious little book? The only way the pathetic mute girl can pretend to have a voice?" She ground her heel into the journal, twisting it back and forth, and Lyra felt something inside her chest crack along with the binding, felt something break that she wasn't sure could ever be repaired. Clara finally lifted her boot and kicked the journal across the floor, sending it skidding into the far corner where it hit the wall, with a sound that seemed far too loud in the pre-dawn stillness. And when Lyra scrambled over to retrieve it, she found that the leather binding had torn completely in half, that the pages were scattered and torn, that the charcoal pencil she'd kept tucked inside had snapped into 3 jagged pieces that could never be whole again. The other Omegas had already moved on, already started pulling out ingredients and pots and pans for breakfast, their laughter and chatter filling the kitchen with noise that felt like knives scraping against the inside of Lyra's skull. And none of them looked at her as she knelt there in the corner, her broken journal clutched to her chest, her silver hair dripping with dirty water, her entire body shaking with a combination of rage and despair and exhaustion that was so profound it felt like she might simply disintegrate into nothingness right there on the kitchen floor. She wanted to scream, wanted to let out all the fury and hurt and loneliness that had been building inside her for 24 years of relentless cruelty and rejection. Wanted to make them understand what it felt like to have no voice, to be invisible, to be treated as less than nothing by people who should have been her pack, her family, her support system in a world that was harsh and unforgiving, even to those who fit in perfectly. But she couldn't scream, could never scream, because the curse that stole her voice had also stolen her ability to make any sound at all beyond the softest breath, the quietest sigh, the kind of noises that nobody noticed or cared about because they barely registered as existing at all. She gathered the torn pages of her journal with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, carefully collecting each piece as if she could somehow put it back together through sheer force of will. As if she could repair this broken thing the same way she wished someone would repair her. Would see past the curse and the silence and the silver hair to the person underneath who just wanted to be valued, to be heard, to matter to someone, anyone, in a world that had made it abundantly clear that she was unwanted. The torn leather felt like failure in her hands, felt like a physical manifestation of everything that was wrong with her life. And as she pressed the pieces together in a futile attempt to make them whole again, she felt something inside her make a decision, felt some part of her broken heart finally give up on the hope that things would ever get better, that she would ever be anything other than the mute freak, the ghost girl, the cursed Omega that nobody wanted. She tucked the ruined journal into the pocket of her soaking wet dress and stood on legs that felt weak and unsteady. And she walked out of the kitchen without looking back, walked out into the pre-dawn darkness where the air was crisp and cold and clean, where she could breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in on her, where she could exist for just a moment without someone reminding her of all the ways she was insufficient. Her feet carried her without conscious thought through the packed territory, past the sleeping houses where families lived in warmth and comfort and belonging, past the training grounds where warriors would soon gather to practice their combat skills, past the healer's cottage where old Wren lived, the only person in the entire pack who had ever shown her consistent kindness, the only wolf who looked at her and saw something worth protecting instead of something that needed to be discarded. She walked until she reached the edge of pack territory, where the dense forest gave way to rocky cliffs that overlooked a valley so deep and dark that you couldn't see the bottom even in full daylight, where the sound of rushing water from the river far below created a constant white noise that drowned out all other sounds, where the wind whipped across the exposed stone with enough force to steal the breath from your lungs and make your eyes water from the cold. This was where she always came when the pain became too much to bear, when the weight of her existence felt like it would crush her into dust, when she needed to be somewhere that matched the emptiness she felt inside, somewhere wild and dangerous and unforgiving that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if Lyra had any capacity left to appreciate beauty. But she felt numb inside, felt like something essential had been carved out of her chest and thrown off this very cliff, leaving nothing behind but a hollow space that ached with every breath. She stood at the edge, her toes inches from where solid ground gave way to empty air, and she looked down into that darkness and wondered what it would feel like to fall. Wondered if the terror of falling would be worse than the terror of continuing to live in a world that had no place for her. Wondered if anyone would even notice she was gone, or if they would simply be relieved that the burden of her existence had been lifted from their shoulders. 3 days from now, the Shadow Moon Pack would hold their Winter Moon Festival, a celebration of pack bonds and unity and belonging. And 3 days from now, Alpha Marcus had already announced she would be formally banished from pack territory cast out to fend for herself in a wilderness that would show her no more mercy than her pack had shown, sentenced to a slow death by exposure and starvation, because no pack would take in a cursed, mute Omega with no family and no connections and nothing to offer except the healing gift that nobody valued because it couldn't be used for warfare or politics or any of the things that packs actually cared about. She pulled the broken journal from her pocket and looked at it one last time. This thing that had been her voice for so many years, this collection of pages where she had poured out her thoughts and feelings and desperate attempts to communicate with a world that rarely bothered to listen, and then with emotion that felt both casual and ceremonial. She threw it over the edge of the cliff, watched it tumble through the air, pages separating and scattering like silver birds in the growing light, falling down and down and down until they disappeared into the darkness below. And with them went the last tiny spark of hope that Lyra had been carrying, that maybe somehow things could get better. She took a step closer to the edge, then another, until the tips of her worn boots were hanging out over nothing but air, until one more step would send her tumbling after her journal, until the decision between living and dying was reduced to the simple physics of whether she shifted her weight forward or backward. And in that moment, standing between the world she knew and the void that called to her, Lyra Moonwhisper felt nothing but a vast, empty peace at the thought that soon, very soon, she would finally be free. The sound of footsteps behind her, quick and purposeful, shattered the stillness of the moment, and before she could turn to see who had followed her, before she could make the choice that she had come here to make, a strong hand wrapped around her wrist and yanked her backward with such force that she stumbled and fell against a solid, warm chest. And a voice that she had never heard before, deep and commanding, and filled with something that sounded almost like desperation, spoke words that would change the entire trajectory of her life forever, when he said, simply and with absolute conviction, "Don't." Lyra's heart was hammering against her ribs with such force that she could feel it echoing through her entire body as she struggled against the iron grip that held her wrist, her free hand coming up to push against the chest of whoever had grabbed her, whoever had dared to interfere with her final moment of peace, whoever had the audacity to pull her back from the edge when all she wanted was for the pain to stop, for the endless cycle of rejection and cruelty to finally, mercifully end. The hand around her wrist was large and warm despite the cold morning air, the grip firm but somehow not painful, not cruel, not designed to hurt her the way every other touch in her life had been designed to hurt. And when she finally managed to twist around enough to look up at the face of her rescuer, the breath left her lungs in a rush that had nothing to do with the struggle and everything to do with the shock of recognition that slammed through her. Not recognition of this specific person because she had never seen him before in her life, but recognition of something else, something deeper, something that whispered in the very marrow of her bones that this moment was important, that this person was important, that nothing would ever be the same again. He was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders that blocked out the lightning sky behind him, and his face was all sharp angles and strong lines that would have been intimidating if not for the expression in his eyes, those striking ice-blue eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light in the dawn shadows. Eyes that were looking at her not with disgust or pity, or any of the expressions she had grown accustomed to seeing on the faces of wolves who looked at her, but with something that looked almost like wonder, almost like recognition, almost like he had been searching for something and had just found it in the most unexpected place possible. His hair, long and flowing past his shoulders in a way that was unusual for male wolves who typically kept their hair short for practical purposes during fights and hunts, caught her attention immediately because it was silver, the exact same shade as her own. That rare coloring that marked both of them as different, as other, as touched by something that most wolves would never understand. And seeing her own unusual hair color reflected back at her in this stranger's appearance made something twist painfully in her chest, made her want to reach out and touch those silver strands just to confirm that they were real, that she wasn't hallucinating this impossible moment. "Please," the stranger said, his voice dropping to something softer, something gentler, something that felt like it was meant only for her, even though they were alone on this cliff with nothing but the wind and the distant sound of the river below to bear witness to this encounter. "Please, don't do what I think you were about to do, because I heard your music carried on the wind from somewhere in this forest, and I followed it here, thinking I would find someone playing for the joy of it, for the love of the sound, and instead, I find you standing at the edge of oblivion, looking like you've already made peace with falling." His words should have been intrusive, should have felt like a violation of the private moment she had carved out for herself, but instead, they felt like the first time in her entire life that someone had actually seen her, had looked past the surface of her cursed existence to the desperation and pain that lived beneath, and she found herself going still in his grasp, found the fight draining out of her limbs as exhaustion crashed over her in a wave so powerful that she would have collapsed if he hadn't been holding her upright. Lyra shook her head frantically, trying to convey without words that he was mistaken, that she hadn't been playing any music, that she couldn't have been because her flute, the one that old Wren had given her just yesterday, had fallen from her fingers and tumbled down into the ravine along with her journal, lost forever in the darkness below. But the stranger was looking at her with such intensity that she felt pinned in place by his gaze, felt like he could see straight through to her soul and read every thought she had ever had, every fear she had ever carried, every desperate wish for something more than the life she had been given. He finally released her wrist, but only to reach up with both hands and gently lower the dark traveling cloak hood that had been shadowing the upper half of his face, and in the growing light of dawn, she could see him fully now, could see the aristocratic features that spoke of good breeding and careful genetics, could see the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow and added a touch of roughness to otherwise perfect features, could see the way his ice blue eyes seemed to soften as he studied her face with the kind of attention that people usually reserved for things they considered precious or valuable or worth protecting. "You can't speak," he said after a long moment of silence, and it wasn't a question, but rather a statement of fact, an observation delivered with neither judgment nor pity, just simple acknowledgement of a truth that most people treated as a personal failing on her part, as evidence of the curse that made her unworthy of belonging anywhere or to anyone. Lyra nodded slowly, her hand instinctively going to her throat in the gesture she had developed over the years, the physical manifestation of the frustration and helplessness that came from having thoughts and feelings and desperate needs that she could never voice, that she could never share in the way that normal wolves shared them, through the simple act of opening their mouths and letting words spill out into the world, where others could hear them and respond to them and validate them. The stranger's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pain, almost like her confirmation of his observation had hurt him somehow, had struck some chord within him that resonated with her own suffering. And when he spoke again, His voice was rough with an emotion that she couldn't quite identify, but that made her chest feel tight and her eyes burn with tears that she refused to let fall. "My name is Theron," he said, taking a small step back to give her space, to give her room to breathe, to make it clear that he wasn't trying to trap her or force her into anything, even though he had literally just pulled her back from the edge of a cliff and saved her life whether she wanted it saved or not. "I'm traveling through packed territories with my guard, and we made camp about a mile from here, and I was awake before dawn because I couldn't sleep. Because I've been searching for something for so long that I've almost given up hope of ever finding it. And then I heard the most beautiful music I've ever experienced in my life. A melody that spoke of heartbreak and loneliness and a kind of pain that I recognized because I felt it myself. And I followed that sound here to this cliff where I found you." He paused, his silver hair catching the first rays of sunlight that were beginning to break over the horizon, turning it into something that looked like liquid metal, like moonlight made solid, like magic given physical form. "But you're telling me you weren't playing music, which means either I'm losing my mind or something else is happening here, something that I don't fully understand yet, but that I know in my bones is important." Lyra wanted to write a response, wanted to pull out her journal and explain everything, wanted to tell him about the curse and the broken journal and the flute that had fallen into the ravine, wanted to make him understand that she was cursed and broken and completely unworthy of the concern she could see in his ice-blue eyes. But her journal was gone, scattered in pieces at the bottom of a cliff, along with any hope she had of communicating in the way she had been communicating for her entire life. And the realization of that loss hit her all over again with fresh intensity that made her knees weak and her vision blur with tears that she had been holding back for hours, for days, for years, for her entire lifetime of accumulated grief and rejection that had finally reached a breaking point on this cold morning at the edge of packed territory. She pressed her hands against her face, trying to hold back the sobs that were building in her chest, even though no sound would come from her throat, trying to maintain some shred of dignity in front of this silver-haired stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and disrupted her carefully planned exit from a world that had never wanted her. But the tears came anyway, streaming down her face and through her fingers, hot and relentless and completely beyond her control. Strong arms wrapped around her before she could process what was happening, pulling her against that solid chest, and one large hand came up to cradle the back of her head, holding her with a gentleness that she had never experienced from anyone except old Wren, holding her like she was something precious instead of something broken. And Theron's voice rumbled through his chest, where her ear was pressed against him, the vibrations of his words traveling through her body even as she heard them with her ears. "It's all right," he murmured, one hand stroking through her silver hair with a tenderness that made her cry harder. "It's all right to fall apart. It's all right to let it out. It's all right to hurt because the moon goddess knows you've been hurting for a long time and you've been doing it alone. And that's not right. That's not how it should be. Nobody should have to carry that much pain in silence." His words broke something open inside her, some dam that she had built to hold back the ocean of grief and despair that had been accumulating since she was 7 years old, and her parents had left her at the border of Shadow Moonpack, like she was garbage they wanted to dispose of, since she was old enough to understand that her inability to speak made her fundamentally different from everyone around her in a way that would never be accepted or celebrated or even tolerated with any kind of grace. She didn't know how long they stood there on that cliff edge, her sobbing silently against his chest, while he held her and murmured words of comfort that nobody had ever bothered to offer her before. While the sun rose higher in the sky and painted the world in shades of gold and amber that seemed too beautiful for the ugliness of her situation. While the wind died down to a gentle breeze that played with their matching silver hair and seemed to whisper secrets that only they could hear. Eventually, when the tears finally stopped coming, because she had simply run out of the physical ability to produce them, when her body was wrung out and exhausted from the emotional storm that had passed through her, Lyra pulled back slightly from Theron's embrace, and she was shocked to realize that he let her go immediately, that he didn't try to hold on or control her, or use her moment of weakness against her the way she had learned to expect from the wolves who had raised her. She looked up at his face and found him watching her with an expression that was so full of compassion and understanding that it made her chest ache with a different kind of pain, the pain of recognizing something beautiful that she knew she could never have, something precious that would be snatched away as soon as he realized what she really was, how fundamentally broken and cursed and unworthy she truly was beneath the surface of her silver hair and unusual eyes. Theron reached into his cloak and pulled out a small leather pouch, and from it, he extracted a piece of paper and a stick of charcoal, offering them to her with a small smile that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish, almost vulnerable, almost like he was the one who needed comfort instead of being the one offering it. "I know you can't speak," he said softly, pressing the paper and charcoal into her hands. "But I'm hoping you can write, because I have so many questions, and I need to understand what brought you to that cliff edge. What pain you're running from or toward. What made you feel like ending your life was the only option left available to you." His words were so earnest, so genuinely concerned, that Lyra found herself taking the paper and charcoal, even though every instinct she had developed over 24 years of survival was screaming at her not to trust this stranger, not to believe in the kindness he was showing her, not to let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, someone could look at her and see something worth saving. Her hands were shaking as she tried to write, tried to form letters that would make sense, tried to explain the unexplainable, but what came out was simply this, written in handwriting that was barely legible because her hands wouldn't stop trembling. "Why do you care? You don't know me. I'm cursed and broken, and my own pack is banishing me in 3 days. Why would you waste your time on someone like me?" Theron read her words, and something flickered across his face, something that looked like anger but not directed at her. Anger on her behalf. Anger at the pack that had treated her so poorly that she genuinely couldn't understand why a stranger would show her basic kindness and compassion. "I care," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, a quality of command that made her wolf instincts sit up and take notice, made her recognize on some primal level that this was not just any wolf, but rather an alpha. And not just any alpha, but one with serious power thrumming beneath his skin. "Because I heard your soul crying out through music that you claim you didn't play. Because I have silver hair just like yours, which marks us both as different in a world that fears difference. Because I stood at a cliff very similar to this one 2 years ago, after my mother died, and I wondered if stepping off would hurt less than continuing to carry the weight of grief and responsibility that threatened to crush me. And because when I look at you, I see something that calls to something deep inside me, something I don't fully understand yet, but that I know is important, is significant, is worth investigating, even if you can't see your own worth right now." The revelation that he had considered ending his own life, that this powerful alpha male who seemed so confident and in control had stood where she was standing and felt what she was feeling, hit Lyra like a physical blow that knocked what little air she had left right out of her lungs. She stared at him with wide eyes, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of this strong, composed, clearly high-ranking wolf with the image of someone broken enough to contemplate suicide. Someone desperate enough to stand at the edge of oblivion and wonder if falling would be a relief instead of a tragedy. She wrote quickly, her handwriting becoming more steady as curiosity began to push through the numbness that had been engulfing her. "But you didn't jump. What stopped you? What made you choose to keep living when the pain was so overwhelming?" Theron read her question and was silent for a long moment, his ice-blue eyes distant as he looked out over the ravine, over the forest beyond, over the mountains that rose in jagged peaks against the morning sky. And when he finally spoke, his voice was soft and contemplative and filled with a kind of hard-won wisdom that only came from surviving your darkest moments and finding meaning on the other side of them. "My mother left me with a task before she died," he said quietly. "A prophecy that she spent her last breath sharing with me, instructions for finding something precious that I would need to complete my life's work. And I realized that if I stepped off that cliff, I would be failing her, would be throwing away the gift she had given me, would be ensuring that her final words to me were wasted on a son who wasn't strong enough to honor her memory by at least trying to fulfill the destiny she had seen for me." He turned back to look at Lyra, and the intensity in his gaze made her feel like he was seeing straight through to the core of her being, seeing parts of her that she had never shown anyone, parts of her that she had barely acknowledged herself. "I'm not going to pretend that choosing to live was easy, or that every day since then has been filled with joy and purpose, because there have been many days when the weight of grief and loneliness and responsibility has felt like too much to bear. But I'm still here, still breathing, still searching for what my mother promised I would find. And this morning, I followed the sound of impossible music to a cliff edge, where I found a woman with silver hair standing on the brink of giving up. And I can't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, this is what I've been searching for. If maybe you are part of the prophecy that has guided my steps for the past 2 years." Lyra's heart was racing now, her mind spinning with the implications of what he was saying, with the impossible suggestion that she could be part of anyone's prophecy, that she could be important to anyone's destiny, that her cursed and broken existence could have meaning beyond being a burden that needed to be cast out and forgotten. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, wanted to explain that she was the last person who should be part of anyone's prophecy, because she was cursed with silence, marked with a punishment that had been inflicted on her bloodline 3 generations ago. But before she could write any of that, before she could crush whatever hope or interest he might have in her, a sound drifted up from the forest below them. The sound of voices calling out in organized patterns. The sound of a search party moving through the wilderness. And Lyra's blood ran cold as she recognized the harsh, commanding voice of Alpha Marcus shouting orders to his warriors, shouting her name with a fury that promised violence, shouting accusations that she had stolen from the packhouse and run away in the night. Accusations that she knew were completely fabricated, but that the pack would believe without question, because they had always been looking for an excuse to be rid of her permanently. Theron's expression hardened as he heard the voices, as he processed the tone of command and the content of the accusations being hurled into the morning air. And he moved with fluid grace to position himself between Lyra and the direction the voices were coming from, his body language shifting from comforting to protective in the space of a heartbeat. And when he spoke, His voice carried the unmistakable quality of alpha command that made Lyra's wolf want to submit even though he wasn't her alpha, would never be her alpha, couldn't possibly want anything to do with her once he understood the full extent of her situation. "Those wolves are looking for you," he said, and it wasn't a question, and Lyra nodded miserably, her brief moment of connection and hope already crumbling as reality crashed back down on her with brutal efficiency. "And they're accusing you of theft, which I'm guessing is a lie designed to give them legal justification for punishing you more severely than a simple banishment would allow." Lyra nodded again, her hands clutching the paper and charcoal he had given her, her mind racing through options that all seemed to end with her either dead or wishing she was dead. Because if Marcus caught her now, after she had run away and made him look foolish by forcing him to send out a search party, he would make an example of her in the most brutal way possible to ensure that no other Omega ever dared to defy his authority again. "Come with me," Theron said suddenly, urgently, reaching out to take her hand in his, and the moment their skin touched, Lyra felt something electric pass between them, something that made her gasp and made his eyes widen with recognition and wonder, something that felt like destiny and fate and all the things that fairy tales were made of, but that couldn't possibly be real, couldn't possibly be happening to someone like her, who had been abandoned and rejected and cast aside by everyone who had ever known her. "My camp is hidden and protected. My guards are loyal and skilled, and I give you my word as an alpha that no one will touch you while you're under my protection. No one will hurt you or drag you back to that pack that has treated you with such cruelty, and once you're safe, we can figure out what comes next, what options you have, what future might be possible for someone with silver hair and a silence that I suspect is not the curse you think it is, but rather something else entirely, something that my mother's prophecy hinted at, something that makes you far more important than you've ever been allowed to believe." The voices were getting closer now, crashing through the underbrush with the subtlety of a hunting party that was more interested in making a statement than in actually finding their prey quietly, and Lyra knew she had seconds to make a decision that would determine the entire course of her future. Seconds to choose between the certain brutality of Alpha Marcus's justice and the uncertain promise of this silver-haired stranger who looked at her like she mattered, who touched her like she was precious, who spoke to her like she had value beyond her ability to scrub floors and serve meals and stay silent in the face of cruelty. She looked into those ice-blue eyes one more time, searching for any hint of deception or manipulation or the kind of cruelty that had been masked as kindness so many times before in her life. But all she saw was sincerity and urgency and something else, something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition, like he had been searching for her specifically, even though that made no sense, even though they had never met before, this moment on this cliff, at the edge of her darkest hour. The sound of branches breaking signaled that the search party was almost upon them, that in moments they would emerge from the tree line and see her standing here with this stranger, that all choices would be taken away from her if she didn't act now, didn't decide now, didn't take this impossible leap of faith with a man whose name she barely knew, but whose presence made her feel something she had never felt before. Something that might have been hope or might have been delusion, but that was strong enough to make her hand tighten around his, strong enough to make her nod once, sharply, acceptance and surrender and desperate prayer, all wrapped up in a single gesture. Theron's face transformed with relief and something that looked like triumph, and before Lyra could process what was happening, he had swept her up into his arms like she weighed nothing at all, like she was something precious that needed to be carried instead of something broken that deserved to be left behind. And he was running with supernatural speed through the forest in the opposite direction from the search party, his feet finding purchase on ground that seemed too treacherous for such speed. His breathing barely elevated even as he carried her weight and navigated the wilderness with the kind of skill that spoke of years of training and natural ability that far exceeded anything a normal alpha should possess. They ran until the voices faded behind them, ran until the only sounds were their breathing and the whisper of wind through trees and the thundering of Lyra's heart that felt like it might beat straight out of her chest. And when Theron finally slowed and then stopped in a small clearing that seemed to appear out of nowhere, Lyra looked around and saw 8 wolves materialize from the shadows of the surrounding forest. 8 massive warriors with eyes that glowed with power and loyalty as they looked at Theron, as they saw her cradled in his arms, as they dropped immediately to one knee in a gesture of respect that made absolutely no sense for traveling merchants' guards to show to their employer. Theron set Lyra down gently, making sure she was steady on her feet before releasing her. And then he turned to address his guards with a voice that carried absolute authority and a quality of command that finally made the truth crash over Lyra in a wave of shock and disbelief, and something that might have been terror or might have been awe as he said, "Kale, take the others and make sure we weren't followed, and then break camp immediately because we're leaving this territory within the hour, and I need you all to understand something very important before we go any further." He turned to look at Lyra, and the expression on his face was so full of reverence and wonder, and barely contained joy, that it made her legs feel weak, made her want to run and stay in equal measure, made her entire world tilt on its axis as he continued, "This is Lyra, and unless I'm very much mistaken, and every sign I've been searching for is somehow coincidentally appearing all at once, she is my mate, my Luna, and the fulfillment of the prophecy that my mother spent her dying breath sharing with me, which means that as of this moment, she is under the absolute protection of the Alpha King of the Northern Crown, and anyone who threatens her threatens me personally." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, like something solid and undeniable that pressed against Lyra's chest and made it impossible to breathe, impossible to think, impossible to process what she had just heard, because surely she had misunderstood. Surely this couldn't be real. Surely the silver-haired stranger who had pulled her back from the edge of oblivion and carried her away from the search party and looked at her like she was something precious couldn't possibly be claiming that he was the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in all the Northern Territories, and that she, broken and cursed and voiceless Lyra Moonwhisper, was somehow his destined mate. The 8 guards who had dropped to one knee were still kneeling, their heads bowed in a gesture of absolute submission and respect that made it clear that Theron's claim wasn't some elaborate joke or cruel trick designed to humiliate her further, that he really was who he said he was, that the authority that had been thrumming beneath his skin since the moment she first saw him wasn't just the power of a strong alpha, but rather the concentrated might of royalty, of a bloodline that had ruled the Northern Territories for generations, of a wolf who could command armies with a single word and reshape the political landscape of their entire world with a casual decision. Lyra's hands were shaking so badly that she dropped the paper and charcoal that Theron had given her, watched them fall to the forest floor in what felt like slow motion, and she took a stumbling step backward, her mind screaming at her to run, to flee, to get away from this impossible situation before it could hurt her even worse than she had already been hurt, because there was no universe in which someone like her could be the mate of someone like him. No reality in which a cursed Omega, with no voice and no value, could stand beside the Alpha King as his equal. No possible future in which this didn't end with her being rejected even more spectacularly and painfully than she had been rejected by every other male who had ever looked at her and found her wanting. Theron must have seen the panic on her face, must have read the terror in her violet-gray eyes, because he was moving toward her with his hands raised in a gesture of peace and reassurance, his expression shifting from triumph to concern in the space of a heartbeat. And when he spoke, his voice was gentle and careful, like he was trying to soothe a wild animal that was on the verge of bolting into the wilderness and never being seen again. "Lyra, please don't run," he said, and there was something almost desperate in his tone, something vulnerable that seemed completely at odds with the revelation that he was the Alpha King, that he commanded more power and authority than she could even comprehend. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you're scared. I know every instinct you have is probably telling you that this can't be real, that someone like me couldn't possibly want someone like you. But I need you to listen to me for just a moment. Need you to hear what I'm about to tell you before you make any decisions about running or rejecting what's happening between us." He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his ice-blue eyes, but far enough that she didn't feel trapped or cornered. And he took a deep breath before continuing, his silver hair catching the morning light that filtered through the trees and making him look like something out of legend, like a figure from the old stories that Wren used to tell her about fated mates and destiny, and the mysterious ways that the moon goddess worked to bring the right souls together. "My mother was a seer, gifted with prophecy and visions that showed her fragments of the future, and before she died 2 years ago, she used the last of her strength to share with me a vision she'd been carrying for most of her life. A vision about the mate I was destined to find, and the role that mate would play not just in my life, but in the future of our entire kingdom." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers, and Lyra found herself frozen in place despite every instinct screaming at her to run, found herself unable to move as he spoke words that would fundamentally reshape her understanding of her own existence. Words that fell from his lips like drops of silver moonlight that illuminated corners of her soul that had been dark for so long she'd forgotten they existed. "She told me that my true mate would have silver hair like mine, marking her as my equal, even though the world around her would never recognize that equality, that she would be broken and silenced by those who couldn't see her worth, that she would have lost all hope by the time I found her, that she would be standing on the edge of giving up when I finally crossed her path." His voice grew rougher with emotion as he continued, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides like he wanted to reach for her, but was holding himself back through sheer force of will. "She told me that my mate would heal me in ways I didn't yet know I was wounded, that together we would break an ancient curse and unite what had been divided, that her gift would be the kind of power that worked through compassion and connection rather than through force and domination, and that I would know her the moment I heard her true voice, even if that voice didn't speak in words the way other wolves' voices did." The words hit Lyra like physical blows, each one striking against the armor of self-hatred and worthlessness that she had built around herself over 24 years of rejection and cruelty, each one finding the cracks in her defenses and seeping through to touch the vulnerable, desperate part of her that had always wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a reason for her suffering, a purpose for her curse, a meaning hidden in the darkness that had defined her entire life. She wanted to write a response, wanted to tell him that he was mistaken, that she couldn't possibly be the mate from his mother's prophecy because she was too broken, too damaged, too fundamentally flawed to be anyone's destiny. But her hands were empty because she had dropped the paper and charcoal, and even if she'd had them, she wasn't sure she could have formed coherent words because her mind was spinning too fast, processing too much, trying to reconcile the image she had of herself as worthless and cursed with the image that Theron was presenting of her as important and chosen and necessary. One of the guards, the one Theron had called Kyle, rose from his kneeling position and approached cautiously, and he bent down to retrieve the paper and charcoal that Lyra had dropped, offering them to her with a bow that was so respectful, so reverent, that it made tears burn behind her eyes because nobody had ever bowed to her. Nobody had ever treated her with anything approaching respect, and the cognitive dissonance of being shown such honor by a warrior who clearly held significant rank in the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories was almost too much for her overwhelmed mind to process. She took the paper and charcoal with trembling hands and wrote quickly, her handwriting messy and desperate as she tried to make Theron understand the impossibility of what he was suggesting, tried to make him see reason before this went any further, and caused even more pain when the inevitable rejection came. Your mother's prophecy must have been about someone else, someone worthy, someone who can actually speak and lead and stand beside you in a way that inspires confidence instead of pity. Because I can't do any of those things. I can't give speeches to your people or comfort your warriors with words of encouragement or sing lullabies to the children we would never have. Because what kind of mother can't call out to her pups when they're in danger? Can't soothe them with her voice when they're scared? Can't tell them she loves them in words they can hear and understand? She thrust the paper toward him, and Theron read it with an expression that shifted from understanding to something that looked almost like anger, but not anger at her, anger for her. Anger at a world that had convinced her so thoroughly of her own worthlessness that she couldn't even conceive of being valued for who she was, rather than for what she could do. Lyra, he said, and there was such intensity in his voice that it made her wolf sit up and pay attention, made her body respond to the alpha command that threaded through his words, even though he was clearly trying to keep his power leashed, trying not to overwhelm her with the full force of what he was. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because I can see that the wolves who raised you spent your entire life convincing you that your silence made you less than, that your inability to speak in the traditional way made you broken and unworthy. But they were wrong, Lyra. They were so fundamentally, catastrophically wrong that I want to find every single one of them and make them understand the magnitude of their mistake in the most painful way possible. He took a step closer, then another, moving with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of absolute confidence in his own body and his own power. And when he was close enough to touch her, he reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, tilting her head up so that she had no choice but to meet his gaze, had no choice but to see the absolute conviction that burned in those ice-blue eyes. When I was standing at the edge of the cliff before dawn, when I was trying to find the courage to keep searching for something I was beginning to think didn't exist, I heard music, Lyra. I heard the most beautiful, heartbreaking melody I've ever experienced in my entire life, a song that spoke directly to my soul and told me a story of pain and loneliness and desperate hope that mirrored everything I've been feeling for the past 2 years. He paused, his thumbs stroking gently across her cheekbones, wiping away tears that she hadn't even realized were falling. And when he continued, his voice was softer, more intimate, like he was sharing a secret that was meant only for her. You told me you weren't playing music, and I believe you. I believe that you didn't consciously create those sounds. But Lyra, I heard them. My wolf heard them. My very soul heard them and responded to them and followed them to you because that music was your voice, your true voice, the voice that exists beneath the curse that stole your ability to speak in the way that other wolves speak, the voice that communicates directly from your heart to the hearts of those who are meant to hear it. His words were so earnest, so filled with certainty, that Lyra found herself wanting to believe him, found herself reaching for the hope he was offering, even though accepting that hope meant opening herself up to the kind of devastating pain that would come if he was wrong, if this was all some terrible mistake or cosmic joke, if she allowed herself to believe that she might be worthy of him only to have that belief shattered when reality reasserted itself. She pulled back from his touch. Not because it wasn't wonderful, not because his hands on her face didn't feel like the first real comfort she'd experienced in longer than she could remember, but because she needed space to think, needed distance to process, needed to not be overwhelmed by the physical sensation of being touched with gentleness and care by someone who looked at her like she was precious. She wrote frantically, her need to communicate overriding her exhaustion and fear and confusion, and the words that emerged on the paper were raw and honest in a way that would have terrified her if she'd had the emotional energy left for terror. I want to believe you. I want to believe that there's a reason for everything I've suffered, that there's a purpose to this curse that has defined every moment of my life, that the moon goddess marked me with silence for something other than punishment. But I'm so scared, Theron. I'm so terrified of letting myself hope only to have that hope crushed, when you realize that I really am as broken as everyone has always told me I am, that I really can't be what you need, that I really am just a cursed Omega who was meant to die alone on that cliff edge before you interfered. She showed him the paper, and Theron read it with an expression that made her chest ache, because it was so full of compassion and understanding and a fierce protectiveness that she didn't know what to do with, didn't know how to accept, didn't know how to trust after a lifetime of learning that trust only led to more pain. Then let me prove it to you, Theron said simply, taking her hand in his, and the moment their skin touched, that same electric sensation passed between them, that same jolt of recognition and connection that had happened on the cliff. But this time it was stronger, more insistent, more impossible to ignore or explain away as imagination or wishful thinking. Come back to my territory. Spend time with me and my pack. Let me show you that your silence isn't a curse, but rather a different kind of gift. Let me help you discover what your true voice sounds like when it's given the space and safety to emerge. He squeezed her hand gently, his ice blue eyes searching hers. I'm not asking you to accept the mate bond right now. I'm not asking you to make any permanent decisions or commitments. I'm just asking you to give yourself a chance, to give us a chance, to see if maybe my mother's prophecy was right, and you are the mate I've been searching for, the Luna my kingdom needs, the woman who will stand beside me, not despite her differences, but because of them. The offer hung between them, tempting and terrifying in equal measure. And Lyra knew that if she accepted, if she took this leap of faith with a man she'd known for less than a morning, she would be stepping into a completely unknown future, with no guarantee that it would be better than the past she was leaving behind. But when she really thought about it, when she really examined her options with brutal honesty, she realized that the alternative was either going back to face Alpha Marcus's wrath and almost certain death, or running alone into the wilderness, where she would probably die of exposure or starvation within weeks. And at least Theron's offer came with the possibility, however slim, however unlikely, that maybe her life could be something more than endless suffering and rejection. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the silver hair that matched hers, the ice blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, the strong features that would have been intimidating, if not softened by the genuine care and concern he was showing her, the powerful body that radiated authority and strength, but that had held her with such gentleness when she was falling apart on the cliff edge, and she made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She picked up the charcoal and wrote 3 words on the paper. 3 words that felt like surrender and courage and desperate prayer, all rolled into one. 3 words that would change the entire trajectory of her life. I'll come with you. The smile that broke across Theron's face was so radiant, so full of relief and joy, and something that looked almost like love, even though they'd just met, that it took Lyra's breath away and made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had made the right choice, if maybe this was the moment when her life finally started to become something other than an exercise in survival and pain. Theron pulled her into his arms again, holding her close but not too tight, giving her room to breathe, but making it clear through his touch that he valued her presence, that he wanted her near, that she mattered to him in a way that nobody had ever made her feel like she mattered before. "Thank you," he whispered against her silver hair, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for being brave enough to trust me. Thank you for giving me the chance to show you that you're not broken. Thank you for not jumping off that cliff, because if you had, I would have lost something infinitely precious before I even had the chance to know what I was losing." They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms while the 8 guards quietly and efficiently broke down the camp around them. And Lyra felt something shift inside her chest, felt some small seed of hope begin to take root in the barren landscape of her heart, felt the first tentative stirrings of the possibility that maybe her life could be about more than just surviving until the next rejection, the next cruelty, the next reminder that she was unwanted. The journey to the Northern Crown territory took 5 days of steady travel through wilderness that gradually transformed from the dense forests and rocky cliffs of the Shadow Moonpack lands to the sweeping tundra and ice-touched beauty of the far north. And during those 5 days, Lyra learned what it felt like to be valued, to be protected, to be treated like her presence was a gift rather than a burden. Theron walked beside her for hours each day, communicating with her through the paper and charcoal he always made sure she had, asking her questions about her life and her gifts and her dreams, listening with genuine interest to her written responses, sharing stories about his own childhood and his mother's teachings and the loneliness of leadership that had defined his adult life. The guards, who she learned were called the Silver Guard and were the most elite warriors in the entire Northern Territories, treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence, always making sure she had the warmest spot by the fire at night, always offering her the best portions of food at meals, always positioning themselves as a protective barrier between her and any potential threats. And slowly, painfully slowly, Lyra began to believe that maybe this wasn't an elaborate trick. Maybe these wolves really did see value in her. Maybe Theron really meant what he said about her being his destined mate. On the 5th night, when they were less than a day's journey from the Northern Crown Palace, Theron took Lyra away from the camp to a small clearing where the aurora borealis danced across the sky in ribbons of green and purple and blue that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the world itself. And he sat beside her on a fallen log and took her hand in his, threading their fingers together in a gesture that had become natural and comfortable over the days of travel. "Tomorrow we arrive at my home," he said quietly, his eyes on the dancing lights above them. "And when we do, you'll be introduced to my pack as my mate, as their Luna. And I need you to understand something important before that happens, Lyra. I need you to know that regardless of what my mother's prophecy said, regardless of what the mate bond is telling both of us, I want you to know that you have a choice in this, that you don't have to accept the bond just because fate says we're meant to be together, that I will give you all the time you need to decide if this is really what you want." He turned to look at her, his ice blue eyes reflecting the aurora's light. "I've felt the mate bond since the moment I touched you on that cliff, felt it settle into my chest like it had been waiting my entire life to find its home. But I know that you've spent your whole life having choices taken away from you, having your autonomy stripped by wolves who treated you like property instead of a person. And I refuse to be another male who decides your future without your input, who claims you without your consent, who forces you into a role you might not want just because destiny says we're supposed to be together." Lyra's eyes filled with tears at his words, at the recognition that he was giving her something no one had ever given her before: the power to choose her own path, the agency to decide her own future, the respect of being treated like her wants and needs mattered as much as anyone else's. And she realized in that moment, sitting beside him under the dancing lights with his hand warm in hers, that she had already made her choice, had already decided somewhere during those 5 days of travel that this silver-haired alpha who saw her silence as a gift instead of a curse was someone she wanted to build a life with, someone she wanted to stand beside, someone she wanted to love, even though she'd never had the chance to learn what love looked like when it was healthy and reciprocal and built on mutual respect. She pulled out her paper and charcoal and wrote carefully, her handwriting steady now, confident in a way it hadn't been since the morning Clara had broken her journal. "I choose you, Theron, not because of prophecy or destiny or the mate bond, but because you sat with me at a cliff edge when I was ready to give up on life, and you showed me that maybe there were still reasons to keep breathing, because you've spent 5 days treating me like I'm someone worth knowing instead of someone who needs to be fixed. Because when I imagine my future now, it includes you and the life we could build together. And that's a future I want to be brave enough to reach for." When Theron read her words, his expression transformed into something so full of joy and love and reverent awe that Lyra felt her breath catch, felt something warm and bright bloom in her chest where the seed of hope had been growing. And when he leaned in to kiss her for the first time, it felt like coming home to a place she'd never been, like finding something she hadn't known she was missing. Like every moment of suffering and rejection and loneliness had been leading her to this exact point in time where she was sitting under the aurora borealis being kissed by the Alpha King, who looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his entire world. The mate bond flared between them when their lips met, silver light exploding outward in a wave of power that made the guards back at camp look up in wonder, and Lyra felt something shift in her throat, felt something that had been locked away her entire life begin to unlock, felt the curse that had stolen her voice begin to crack and crumble under the weight of true love's recognition. And when she opened her mouth in surprise at the sensation, a sound emerged. Not words exactly, but a pure, crystalline tone that resonated through the clearing and made the aurora above them pulse brighter, made the very air around them shimmer with power, made Theron pull back with eyes wide with wonder as he realized what was happening. "Your voice," he breathed, his hands coming up to frame her face as the sound continued to pour from her throat, as Lyra discovered that she could shape it with intention, could make it rise and fall like music, could use it to communicate emotions and meanings that went far deeper than words ever could. Lyra, your true voice. This is what my mother meant. This is the gift that was hidden beneath the curse. This is what makes you extraordinary. The sound gradually faded as Lyra learned to control it, learned to call it forth and let it rest. And when silence fell again, it was a different kind of silence than she'd known her entire life. A silence that came from choice rather than from inability. A silence that held power rather than powerlessness. And she knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed. That she had changed. That the girl who had stood on that cliff, ready to end her life, no longer existed because she had been transformed by love and acceptance and the recognition that her differences were what made her special, rather than what made her broken. The next morning, when they crested the final rise and the Northern Crown Palace came into view, all crystalline towers and soaring architecture that seemed to grow organically from the frozen landscape, Lyra felt no fear, felt only anticipation and excitement, and the deep, bone-settling certainty that she was finally going home to a place where she belonged, where she was wanted, where her voice, however different it might be from everyone else's, would be heard and valued and celebrated for the gift it truly was. Years later, when young wolves who felt broken and different and voiceless came to Luna Lyra seeking guidance and hope, she would take their hands and communicate directly to their hearts through her gift, would show them through her own story that sometimes the things we think make us unworthy are actually the things that make us irreplaceable. That the moon goddess marks her special children with trials and tribulations, not as punishment, but as preparation for the greatness they're destined to achieve, and she would watch them leave her presence standing taller, believing more firmly that their voices mattered, regardless of how those voices sounded, that their worth was inherent and unchangeable, regardless of how the world around them chose to value or devalue them. And every time she touched a broken soul and helped them find their way back to hope, she would remember that morning on the cliff when she had been ready to give up, when she had believed her silence meant she had nothing to offer the world, when a silver-haired stranger had appeared out of nowhere and shown her that sometimes being saved means being seen for who you truly are by someone brave enough to look past the surface to the infinite value that lies beneath. If you found yourself moved by Lyra and Theron's journey from despair to hope, from silence to voice, from rejection to acceptance, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Would love to know which moments resonated most deeply with you, which parts of their story reflected your own struggles or dreams or experiences with feeling different or voiceless or unworthy, because your engagement and feedback is what makes creating these stories worthwhile. What reminds me that we all carry some form of silence or curse or difference that makes us feel alone. And sharing these tales of transformation and love helps us remember that we're never as alone as we think we are. That somewhere out there is someone who will see our differences as gifts, who will value our unique voices even when they don't sound like everyone else's, who will choose us not despite our brokenness, but because of the strength we've gained from surviving it. Please subscribe to this channel so you won't miss future stories of werewolf romance, alpha kings, fated mates, and the transformative power of love that sees worth where others see only flaws, and hit that notification bell so you'll know the moment a new tale is ready to be shared, because there are so many more stories waiting to be told about wolves who found their voices, their mates, their destinies in the most unexpected ways, and I want you to be there for every single one of them. To be part of this community of people who believe that being different isn't a curse, but rather the first sign that you're destined for something extraordinary.